May 11th, 1945. 10 minutes past 10 in the morning, 70 miles east of Okinawa. The USS Bunker Hill is cutting through the Pacific swells at 28 knots. Her massive flight deck packed with 34 fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. Corsairs and Helldivers are spotted in tight rows, their wings folded like sleeping birds, their fuel tanks topped off with high-octane aviation gasoline. 500-pound bombs hang from their bellies, rockets bristle from their wings. The morning air smells of exhaust fumes, salt spray, and the nervous sweat of pilots waiting in their cockpits. In less than 5 minutes, the first wave will launch to strike Japanese positions ashore. No one on that deck will launch anything. At 10:13 and 0 seconds, a lookout on the port side screams a warning that dies in his throat. A single Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter has erupted from a low cloud bank less than 2 miles away, diving at 400 miles per hour directly toward the ship's island superstructure. The plane is painted dark green with red circles on its wings. It grows from a speck to a monster in heartbeats. The 5-inch batteries open fire. Tracers streak across the sky. The 40mm guns join in, their rhythmic pounding shaking the deck. But the angle is wrong, and the time is insufficient. The kamikaze pilot holds his dive through the flak, his aircraft shuddering from impacts that would have sent any rational pilot into evasive maneuvers. He is not rational. He is already dead. He just has not stopped moving yet. The Zero releases a 500-pound bomb a fraction of a second before impact. The pilot aims for the base of the island, where he knows the command structure is concentrated. His aim is perfect. The bomb punches through the wooden flight deck, penetrates the gallery deck below, and detonates in Ready Room 4, where 37 pilots are seated in their flight gear, waiting for the launch order. The explosion kills most of them instantly. The Zero itself crashes through the flight deck near frame 93, cartwheeling through a row of parked Corsairs, spewing burning aviation fuel in a spreading arc across the packed aircraft. The plane's fuel tanks rupture. The aircraft fuel tanks rupture. Everything ruptures. 34 aircraft begin to burn. Men are still processing the first impact when the second comes. Exactly 30 seconds after the first Zero struck, a second kamikaze dives from the opposite direction, from the ship's starboard quarter. This pilot has timed his attack with mathematical precision. The anti-aircraft guns are still tracking the smoke from the first impact. Their barrels are pointed the wrong way. The second Zero strikes the aft flight deck at a shallow angle, skidding across the stern like a flaming stone skipping across water. The plane tears through a row of aircraft spotted for launch, spreading burning fuel across the entire aft section of the ship. Its bomb detonates among the parked planes themselves, throwing fragments of aircraft and fragments of men in every direction. Within 60 seconds, the USS Bunker Hill has been hit twice. Her flight deck is a continuous wall of orange flame, stretching from the island to the fantail. Ammunition is cooking off in staccato bursts. Bombs are detonating with irregular thunder. 5-inch rockets are screaming across the deck in random directions, trailing fire, killing men who thought they had reached safety. The temperature at the center of the blaze is approaching 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Men are burning alive inside their cockpits, trapped by jammed canopies, screaming for help that cannot reach them. And the ship is still making 28 knots, driving wind directly into the flames, feeding the inferno with oxygen, spreading fire faster than any damage control party can move. The Bunker Hill would not sink that day, but over 390 sailors and airmen would die in the next 3 hours, not from the kamikazes themselves, not from the initial impacts, but from what came after. From the fire that turned steel decks cherry red, from the smoke that killed faster than the flames, from the explosions that kept coming, wave after wave, for hours, from the impossible choice between staying below to fight the fire and escaping to the deck to breathe, from the aviation gasoline that flowed like burning water through every hatch, every scupper, every crack in the deck. This is the story of hell on the flight deck. The story of what happens when a carrier packed with volatile fuel and live ordnance becomes a crematorium adrift on the Pacific Ocean. The story of the men who walked into that fire anyway, knowing exactly what waited for them. And the story of how damage control saved a ship that should have burned to the waterline. By the spring of 1945, the United States Navy had learned to fear kamikazes more than any other weapon in the Japanese arsenal. The divine wind had become a systematic, industrialized form of suicide warfare. The Japanese were training thousands of pilots for one-way missions, loading obsolete aircraft with explosives, pointing them at the American fleet. The mathematics were brutal. A kamikaze pilot flying an obsolete Zero, loaded with a 500-pound bomb, could trade his life for hundreds of American sailors. Conventional anti-aircraft fire struggled against pilots who held their dives through damage that would have forced any rational attacker to break off. A pilot willing to die could hold his aim until the last millisecond, correcting all the way to impact. He was, in effect, a human-guided missile. And the kamikazes aimed for the most vulnerable point on any carrier, the flight deck. The place where fuel, bombs, and rockets were concentrated in maximum density. The place where one well-placed kamikaze could ignite an inferno that would kill more men than 10 conventional bombs. The Franklin had been crippled in March, losing over 800 men after a bomb attack ignited her armed aircraft. Every carrier sailor had seen the images. Every carrier sailor wondered if his ship could be next. The USS Bunker Hill was an Essex-class fleet carrier, displacing over 27,000 tons, carrying nearly 100 aircraft and 3,000 men. She had been in combat since late 1943, surviving battles from the Gilberts to Iwo Jima. Her crew considered her invincible. She was also the flagship of Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, commander of Task Force 58, the greatest concentration of naval air power in history. On the morning of May 11th, Mitscher was watching from the flag bridge as his pilots prepared to launch against Japanese positions on Okinawa. Nobody expected to be hit. The combat air patrol was airborne. The radar was operating. The gunners were ready. But the Japanese pilots had learned. They had studied American radar coverage, analyzed combat air patrol patterns, learned to approach at wave-top level, beneath the radar horizon. They had learned to use clouds as concealment, to time their attacks for when a carrier's deck was most crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. The first Zero came out of the clouds at 10:13. The 5-inch batteries opened fire, but the angle was steep and the closure rate tremendous. The plane was visible for 10 seconds before impact. Some gunners never saw it. The pilot aimed perfectly. His bomb penetrated 3 decks and detonated in Ready Room 4, where 37 pilots were waiting. The Zero tumbled across the deck, spreading burning fuel through rows of parked aircraft. Now the nightmare began. Aviation gasoline burns differently than other fuels. It does not burn like wood or paper, or even like diesel fuel. It explodes into flame, coating everything it touches with liquid fire that flows like water, but burns like hell itself. The flash point is low. The burn temperature is over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It does not stay where it lands. It flows downward, seeking every opening, every hatch, every ventilation shaft, every crack in the deck plating. The aircraft spotted on the Bunker Hill's deck that morning carried a combined fuel load of tens of thousands of gallons. Each Corsair held 237 gallons. Each Helldiver held 310. The fuel tanks were topped off for the mission, filled to capacity with 100-octane aviation gasoline that was essentially liquid explosive. Each plane also carried ordnance, 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 260-pound fragmentation clusters, 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, 50-caliber ammunition by the thousands of rounds. Some aircraft carried incendiary rockets designed to start fires on the ground. Now they were starting fires on the ship. When the first Zero hit, that fuel began to burn. When the second Zero hit 30 seconds later, striking the aft deck and spreading fire across the stern, the USS Bunker Hill became a floating crematorium. The wind made everything worse. The ship was still steaming at high speed on her original course, driving air across the deck at nearly 30 knots. In normal circumstances, this wind helped clear exhaust fumes and made deck operations safer. Now it was feeding oxygen directly into the flames, turning the fire into a horizontal blowtorch that roared across the entire length of the flight deck with impossible speed. The flames were so intense that men could not approach them. The heat radiated outward in waves that blistered skin at 20 feet and ignited clothing at 10. Men who tried to escape forward found themselves running directly into the wind-driven flames. Men who tried to escape aft found the second impact zone, blocking their path. Men on the flight deck were trapped between 2 infernos, with nowhere to go but over the side. Pilots died in their cockpits, unable to escape the burning aircraft around them. The canopies jammed from the heat, warping the frames. Some men tried to smash their way out with their fists and failed. Some managed to climb out and made it 3 steps before they were engulfed. Some burned where they sat, their screams audible over the roar of the fire until they were not. Flight deck crews were caught between explosions with nowhere to run. These were the plane handlers, the ordnancemen, the fuel crews, the mechanics. They were wearing cotton dungarees and cloth helmets. They had no protection from the flames except their own speed. Some men jumped overboard rather than burn. They fell 60 feet to the water below, some landing well and surviving, others striking the hull or the water wrong and dying from the impact. Some were picked up by the destroyers that rushed to assist. Others were never seen again. Others were blown over the side by the force of detonating bombs. The ordnance aboard the aircraft was not designed to detonate from fire. But heat weakens explosive compounds. Heat warps fusing mechanisms. Heat does unpredictable things to things that were designed to explode. Within the first 5 minutes, the parked aircraft began to explode in sequence as their ordnance cooked off in the heat. First, the small bombs went. Then the rockets, which screamed across the deck on trails of fire, following random trajectories that no one could predict, killing men who thought they had found shelter behind a gun mount or a deck structure. Then the larger bombs, the 500-pounders, which detonated with concussions that knocked men off their feet 100 yards away and threw shrapnel in lethal fans across the burning flight deck. The explosions never stopped. They came in irregular rhythm, one every few seconds, sometimes several at once, sometimes a lull that gave false hope before the next detonation. Each explosion spread more fire. Each explosion threw more shrapnel. Each explosion killed more men who were trying to fight their way to safety. And through all of this, the fire kept spreading, kept growing, kept killing. Below decks, the situation was different, but no less desperate. The first bomb had penetrated deep into the ship before detonating. It had punched through the flight deck, through the gallery deck below, and exploded in the ready room spaces where pilots waited for the launch that would never come. The blast had killed dozens of aviators instantly, men who never saw the enemy that killed them, men who died wondering what the noise above them meant. But the bomb had done something else. It had ruptured fuel lines and ventilation ducts on its way through the ship, creating pathways for burning gasoline and toxic smoke to pour into the interior spaces. The aviation fuel did not need gravity to spread. The pressure of the fire above drove it downward, through every crack, every seam, every imperfection in the deck plating. The men below could not see the fire. They were in compartments with no windows, no view of the sky. They could only feel the heat radiating through the steel bulkheads, turning their living spaces into ovens. They could only smell the smoke that was rapidly filling every compartment. A thick, oily stench that burned the eyes and throat. They could only hear the explosions above them, each one shaking the ship like a depth charge, each one potentially the one that would break through the deck and fill their space with flame. Damage control parties had drilled for this moment. The Navy had learned from previous carrier fires, from the Lexington at Coral Sea, from the Yorktown at Midway, from the Franklin just 2 months earlier. Every carrier sailor knew the basic procedures. Set condition Zebra to seal the watertight compartments, activate the firefighting systems, organize hose teams using the fire mains, evacuate the wounded to battle dressing stations, fight the fire compartment by compartment until it was under control. The men of the Bunker Hill began executing those procedures within seconds of the first impact. Boatswain's mates piped the call to general quarters. Damage control teams grabbed their equipment and headed for their stations. The fire main was pressurized and hoses were broken out. Everything happened according to the plan. What the drills could not prepare them for was the smoke. The fire aboard the Bunker Hill produced smoke unlike anything these men had ever encountered. Burning aviation gasoline creates thick, black, oily smoke that blots out all light within seconds. It fills the lungs with toxic hydrocarbons that attack the respiratory system with every breath. Burning rubber from tires and seals added heavy particulates. Burning electrical insulation released chlorine compounds. Burning paint released lead. Burning aircraft aluminum released metal fumes that scarred lung tissue permanently. Within minutes of the impacts, visibility below decks dropped to absolute zero. Not dim, not hazy, zero. Men could not see their hands in front of their faces. They could not find the hatches that led to safety, they could not find each other. They stumbled through passageways they had walked 1,000 times, suddenly lost in a darkness so complete that direction had no meaning. And they could not breathe. The standard Navy gas masks of 1945 were designed for short-duration use in environments with moderate smoke contamination. They were not designed for hours of continuous exposure to the kind of concentrated toxic atmosphere now filling the Bunker Hill. The filters clogged within minutes. The face pieces fogged from moisture and residue. Men tore off their masks in desperation because they could not breathe through them, then collapsed seconds later from the unfiltered fumes. The ship's ventilation system, designed to supply fresh air throughout the vessel and maintain positive pressure in habitable spaces, had become a death trap. The main intake vents were drawing smoke from the flight deck and distributing it throughout the ship. The smoke traveled through the ducts faster than rumors, spreading into compartments far from the fire, filling spaces that their occupants thought were safe. Sailors who thought they were secure found themselves suddenly surrounded by lethal fumes with no warning. Engine room crews, deep in the bowels of the ship, 3 decks below the waterline, had to keep the massive turbines running, while acrid smoke poured in through every opening. If the engines stopped, the ship would lose all power, all steering, all ability to maneuver away from the task force or toward help. So, they stayed at their posts, breathing through rags soaked in whatever liquid was available, watching their shipmates collapse one by one. Hundreds of men were now trapped in darkness, unable to breathe, unable to see, unable to communicate, with fire above them and cold Pacific water below. The ship was alive with screaming, but the screams were muffled by the smoke, disconnected from visible sources, coming from everywhere and nowhere. This is where the story could have ended. This is where the Bunker Hill could have become another Franklin, another carrier left dead in the water, with most of her crew killed, not by enemy weapons, but by her own burning aircraft. This is where the mathematics of kamikaze warfare should have paid off for the Japanese strategists who had designed the divine wind. But the crew of the USS Bunker Hill refused to die, and one man in particular refused to let them. Commander Joseph Carmichael was the ship's executive officer and damage control coordinator. He had spent 15 years in the Navy, working his way up from ensign to commander through a combination of technical skill and unshakable calm under pressure. He had studied every carrier fire in Navy history. He had written papers on firefighting techniques. He knew the Bunker Hill's internal layout better than almost anyone aboard. And he understood immediately that the standard procedures would not work in this situation. The fire was too widespread to contain conventionally. It covered the entire flight deck and was spreading through multiple internal compartments simultaneously. The smoke was too thick for personnel to work effectively. Men were dying of asphyxiation as fast as they could be replaced on the hose lines. The explosions were too constant to establish any kind of stable firefighting operation. Every time a team pushed forward, another detonation drove them back or killed them where they stood. If the damage control parties kept following the standard playbook, fighting all fires equally, trying to save every space, they would run out of men before they ran out of fire. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. The ship had finite manpower. The fire had effectively infinite fuel. Something had to give. Carmichael made a decision that would be studied in Navy firefighting schools for generations. He ordered the forward damage control parties to concentrate on a single overriding objective, keeping the fire from spreading forward into the aviation gasoline stowage compartments beneath the forward flight deck. The Bunker Hill carried over 200,000 gallons of aviation fuel in her bunker tanks. If that fuel ignited, nothing short of divine intervention would save the ship. The resulting explosion would break her hull. The fire would consume everything. Every man aboard would die. Everything else was secondary. The aircraft on deck would be lost. Much of the stern would be lost. Men currently trapped in compartments aft of the fire line would have to wait for rescue until the main threat was contained. Some would not survive that wait. It was The forward damage control teams executed the order with desperate efficiency. They abandoned their attempts to fight the fires on the flight deck directly. Instead, they concentrated on the boundaries, pouring water and foam on the compartments surrounding the fuel stowage, cooling the steel, preventing the heat from reaching the flashpoint. They sealed every hatch and vent they could reach, trying to starve the fire of additional oxygen pathways. They worked in rotation, each man taking a turn on the hose lines until the smoke forced him to retreat, then crawling to cleaner air while someone else took his place. Meanwhile, on the burning flight deck itself, a different kind of heroism was unfolding without orders or coordination. Chief Sens did not wait for orders. He did not look for an officer to tell him what to do. He grabbed a fire hose, shouted for men to follow him, and headed up through the smoke toward the flight deck. What he found when he emerged was beyond anything training could prepare a man for. The heat was so intense that the steel deck plates were beginning to warp and buckle. They were too hot to touch, even through the soles of heavy work shoes. The paint on the island superstructure was blistering and charring 3 decks up. The air itself seemed to burn when inhaled. Sens did not hesitate. He had men behind him and fire in front of him and wounded shipmates somewhere in between. He led his hose team directly into the flames, the water spray providing just enough cooling to allow them to advance a few feet at a time, searching for any aircraft that might still be saved from total destruction, any wounded man who might still be rescued before the fire reached him. They found both, and neither. The aircraft were beyond saving. Every plane on the flight deck was either burning or about to burn. The fuel had spread too far, and the ammunition was too volatile. But in the gaps between the burning hulks, Sens and his team found living men. Some were wounded, unable to move under their own power. Others were simply paralyzed by shock, crouching behind whatever cover they could find, waiting for death. Sens's team dragged them out. They passed wounded men back along the hose line to other sailors who carried them toward the forward part of the ship. They kept moving forward, kept searching, kept pulling men out of the fire until the fire pushed them back. Other teams followed. Some were organized by officers who had reached the flight deck and started directing efforts. Others formed spontaneously. Groups of sailors who grabbed hoses, grabbed wounded men, grabbed anything useful, and headed toward the screaming. They fought the fire by any means available. They pushed burning aircraft over the side with crashed tractors, clearing the deck one wreck at a time. They threw live bombs overboard with their bare hands, knowing that each one might be the one that cooked off while they held it. They carried wounded men through walls of flame to reach medical stations that were themselves filling with smoke. And they kept dying. The explosions never stopped completely. Every few minutes, another bomb cooked off, another rocket screamed across the deck, another fuel tank ruptured and spread fresh flames across an area that had just been cleared. Men who had just rescued a wounded comrade were killed by shrapnel seconds later. Teams that had fought a fire to extinction watched it reignite when a fresh explosion threw burning debris across their position. The mathematics of heroism are rarely calculated in the moment. But aboard the Bunker Hill that morning, every man who went onto that flight deck understood what he was risking. The fire was visible from miles away. The explosions were audible over the noise of the ship's machinery. Everyone knew that walking onto that deck was likely a one-way trip. They went anyway. They kept going until the fire was out, or they were no longer able to move. Some went out once, came back for water and rest, and went out again. Some went out and never came back. Some went out carrying wounded men and died carrying wounded men. Some went out to rescue specific friends and died without reaching them. If this story has resonated with you so far, consider subscribing so you do not miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of the war at sea. By 11 o'clock, nearly an hour after the first impact, the situation had begun to stabilize. The forward fuel bunkers had been saved. The fire was no longer spreading. The explosions were becoming less frequent as ammunition was exhausted. The Bunker Hill was still burning, but she was no longer in danger of sudden catastrophic loss. But the dying was far from over. Throughout the ship, men were still trapped in darkness. Bodies were piled in passageways where sailors had collapsed, trying to find exits the smoke made invisible. Some died within feet of hatches they could not see. In the engine rooms, crews worked through the last of their respirator capacity, determined to keep the turbines turning, because without power, there would be no fire pumps, no steering, no chance. In medical compartments, doctors performed surgery in near-total darkness. They worked by touch, by memory, by desperate improvisation. The medical personnel never stopped working, even when the smoke forced them to operate on their knees, with their faces near the deck to breathe. Captain George Sides ordered the ship to turn broadside to the wind, a simple maneuver that changed everything. For the past hour, the wind had been feeding air directly into the flames. When the ship turned beam to the wind, the dynamics changed instantly. The fire, deprived of its artificial wind tunnel, began to burn less intensely. For the first time, damage control parties could see what they were fighting. What they saw was devastation beyond comprehension. The flight deck was destroyed. 34 aircraft reduced to twisted, blackened wreckage. The deck plates buckled and warped from heat. The island superstructure scorched and partially collapsed. The entire stern was a charred ruin. Holes had been blown through multiple deck levels by the detonating bombs. Looking down through some of these holes, firefighters could see fires still burning on the gallery deck below, smoke still pouring from compartments that had not yet been reached. The entire stern of the ship was a charred ruin. The aft flight deck was destroyed beyond any possibility of quick repair. The catwalks and gun galleries along the ship's sides were twisted and bent. Bodies were everywhere, some burned beyond recognition, some merely killed by blast or shrapnel, some still wearing expressions of surprise that would never change. But the Bunker Hill was still afloat. Her engines were still running. Her hull below the waterline was still intact. Her rudders still responded to commands from the damaged bridge. Against all probability, against the mathematics of kamikaze warfare, against the logic of what should have happened to a carrier loaded with fuel and bombs and struck by 2 suicide aircraft in 30 seconds, she had survived. The rescue of the trapped men continued for hours after the fire was contained. Sailors formed human chains into the smoke-filled compartments, each man holding the belt of the man in front of him, feeling their way through the absolute darkness to find survivors. The lead man in each chain carried a flashlight, but the smoke was so thick that the beam penetrated only inches. They navigated by touch, by memory of the ship's layout, by the sounds of men calling for help in voices made hoarse by smoke inhalation. They found many bodies, men slumped against bulkheads, men piled at dead-end hatches, men who had crawled toward fresh air and stopped crawling just feet from safety, men who had simply stopped breathing where they stood, overcome by the smoke before they knew what was happening. They also found living men, survivors who had pressed their faces to the deck plates, breathing the thin layer of relatively clean air that sometimes collected at floor level, waiting for rescue that might never come. Survivors who had found pockets of breathable air in sealed compartments and huddled there, listening to the explosions, wondering when the fire would reach them. Survivors who had given up hope, but kept breathing anyway, kept refusing to die until someone came to pull them out. Some rescuers became casualties themselves. The smoke was still thick in many areas, especially in the deeper compartments and the narrow passageways between them. Men who spent too long below decks collapsed from the fumes and had to be carried out by their companions. Some revived with fresh air and went back in. Some never recovered. The final toll of smoke inhalation casualties would not be known for weeks. Some men who seemed fine immediately after the fire developed respiratory problems days later. Some died slowly over weeks as their damaged lungs failed. The medical records of the Bunker Hill would eventually list smoke inhalation as a contributing factor in dozens of deaths that occurred far from the ship, in hospitals across the Pacific and in the United States. Vice Admiral Mitscher had watched the entire battle from his flag bridge, refusing to evacuate, even as flames surrounded his position. When the fires were finally controlled, he transferred his flag to the Enterprise, stepping aboard, looking like a ghost of himself. His uniform was stained with smoke. His face was gray with exhaustion. He would never forget what the kamikazes had done. By early afternoon, the fires were completely extinguished. The flight deck was a blackened graveyard, but it was no longer burning. The Bunker Hill made the voyage to Ulithi under her own power, then was sent back to the United States for full reconstruction. She would never return to combat. The war would end before her repairs were complete. But the men who saved her had already changed the way the Navy fought fires. The lessons were studied intensively in the months that followed. New training programs emphasized smoke as the primary killer. New equipment was designed, including better respirators and improved firefighting foam. New doctrines formalized the concept of prioritized firefighting that Carmichael had implemented under fire. The Navy learned to seal ventilation systems during damage control, to establish clear priorities, to recognize that some men might have to be abandoned to save the ship. The Bunker Hill's survivors taught that individual initiative in the first critical minutes mattered more than any formal chain of command. But the most important lesson could not be taught in any classroom. The Bunker Hill survived because her crew refused to accept that she was lost. They fought fires they could not see. They dragged hoses through explosions. They carried wounded men through smoke that was killing them. And they lived with those decisions for the rest of their lives. That kind of courage cannot be trained. It can only be revealed when the fire comes. The human cost was staggering. 393 men died. Another 264 were wounded, many severely burned or permanently damaged by smoke inhalation. The dead included pilots, air crewmen, deck handlers, mechanics, engineers, officers, and enlisted men, veterans of dozens of missions, and teenagers on their first deployment. Many were never identified. The heat had destroyed all evidence of individual identity. The survivors carried invisible burdens. Many suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress. They relived the fire in dreams. They smelled burning flesh when no fire was present. They saw the faces of men they could not save. Some became advocates for improved fire safety, dedicating post-war careers to ensuring this would never happen again. Others never spoke of it at all, burying memories too deep to reach. If this documentary has helped you understand what these men endured, taking a moment to like and share helps others discover these forgotten stories. The kamikaze campaign against the American fleet at Okinawa would continue for another 2 months after the Bunker Hill was hit. The Divine Wind operations were far from over. Dozens more ships would be struck by suicide aircraft. Thousands more American sailors would die. The kamikazes would claim more American lives in the final year of the Pacific War than any other Japanese weapon system. But the Bunker Hill remained forever a symbol of what American damage control could achieve against the worst that the enemy could throw. She had been struck by 2 coordinated kamikaze attacks within 30 seconds of each other, a timing so precise that it seemed almost choreographed for maximum destruction. She had burned for 3 continuous hours. She had lost nearly 400 men in a single morning. Her flight deck had been destroyed beyond any hope of quick repair. And she had survived. She had carried her crew back to safety. She proved that even a carrier turned into an inferno could be saved if her men refused to abandon her. The Essex-class carriers were tough ships, but no amount of engineering saved the Bunker Hill. What saved her was the courage of ordinary sailors who chose to walk into fire rather than abandon their ship. The Japanese understood this. The kamikazes were causing terrible damage but rarely sinking the largest vessels. The Americans had damage control capabilities Japan could not match. The Divine Wind was killing thousands of pilots without achieving strategic victory. But Japan had no other options. By May 1945, she had lost most of her trained pilots and modern aircraft. The kamikazes were not a choice. They were a last resort. The tragedy was that it killed thousands of young men on both sides without changing the outcome. The American fleet absorbed the damage and kept coming. The kamikazes delayed the inevitable, but could not prevent it. The men who died aboard the Bunker Hill were victims of that calculus. They died because Japan had run out of options. They died because aviation fuel burns at 2,000 degrees. They died doing their jobs in the last months of a war that would end in atomic fire. But they did not die for nothing. The damage control techniques developed that day saved countless lives in decades that followed. The Navy's modern firefighting capabilities trace directly to lessons learned at Okinawa. Every carrier sailor today benefits from the sacrifice of men who walked into that inferno. The physical evidence has vanished. The aircraft wreckage lies on the floor of the Philippine Sea. The ship was scrapped in 1973. No physical monument remains. But the memory persists. The Navy remembers the Bunker Hill. The families remember. And now, perhaps, you will remember too. 393 men died in 3 hours of hell. Hundreds more walked into that hell voluntarily. They saved their ship because they refused to abandon her. They fought fires they could not see. They threw live bombs overboard with bare hands. They dragged wounded men through walls of flame. That is what courage looks like when everything is on fire. The Bunker Hill's battle ended at sunset on May 11th. The fires were out. The ship was saved. The survivors collapsed where they stood. Vice Admiral Mitscher sent a simple message to the crew of his former flagship. Well done. 2 words, not enough. Nothing could be enough. But the men understood. They had saved a ship that was already burning. They had walked into an inferno and walked out. They had fought death and won. The price was 393 of their brothers. The price was wounds that would never heal. The price was nightmares that would last a lifetime. But the ship survived. In the terrible mathematics of naval warfare, that was victory. The Bunker Hill never returned to combat, but she returned to port. She carried her survivors home. She gave them something to hold on to. When everything went wrong, they had not broken. When the fire came, they faced it. When their shipmates needed them, they were there. That is the legacy of the USS Bunker Hill, not the kamikazes that struck her, not the fire that consumed her deck, but the men who refused to let her sink. The flight deck that burned is silent now. The men who fought that day are almost all gone. But somewhere in the Pacific, 70 miles east of Okinawa, the ghosts of 34 aircraft still fall toward the sea, and the smoke still rises from a flight deck that burned 80 years ago. The Bunker Hill remembers. So should we all.